The Zalcrian Empire had conquered 47 star systems in the past century, and their military doctrine was simple enough for any soldier to understand. They would identify weak species across the galaxy, overwhelm them with superior firepower, and assimilate their resources into the growing empire. When their scout ships detected the Sol system during a routine exploration mission, initial reports seemed very promising to the military commanders back at headquarters. Commander Vrektal reviewed the data with deep satisfaction as he sat in his command chamber. The dominant species called themselves humans, and by all galactic standards, they appeared laughably fragile compared to other species the Empire had encountered. No natural armor covered their soft skin. No venomous capabilities existed in their biology. No enhanced strength showed in their muscle structure. Their bone density was average at best. Their reaction times were unremarkable in testing simulations, and their physical durability was concerning to any military analyst. The scouts had captured several visual recordings of these creatures, and Vrektal studied them with growing confidence. They were small, weak, and seemed to spend most of their time on trivial pursuits. Vrektal announced to his war council during the strategic planning session that these creatures were soft beyond belief. He pulled up the biological scans on the main display screen and pointed to various weaknesses. Their young were completely helpless for years after birth, requiring constant care from adults. They required regular sleep cycles that lasted for hours, leaving them vulnerable. They even kept smaller animals as companions rather than as livestock or guards. The intelligence reports showed humans engaging in recreational activities, creating art, and spending enormous resources on entertainment instead of military preparation. They had laws protecting their weak and elderly members instead of culling them for efficiency. To the Zalcrians, who practiced survival of the fittest as both a religious doctrine and a way of life, this was incomprehensible weakness that bordered on stupidity. The War Council agreed unanimously that this would be an easy conquest, and the resources of the Sol system would greatly benefit the Empire. They planned to send a standard occupation force of 200 warships, which was more than sufficient for most primitive species. Vrektal was given command of the operation, and he accepted with pride, knowing this would be a quick victory to add to his record. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, Lieutenant Jake Morrison sat in the communications center of the Terran Defense Station Aegis, monitoring routine traffic as he did every day during his shift. He was young for his position, barely 26 years old, with an easygoing demeanor that made him popular among the crew. His shift had been quiet and boring until the sensors detected something very unusual at the edge of the solar system. Jake leaned forward in his chair, his casual attitude shifting to immediate alertness as the readings came through. Jake called out to Captain Richard Lewis and told him they had multiple ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. His voice carried across the command center, and several other officers turned to look. Captain Richard Lewis moved quickly to the main display screen and studied the sensor readings carefully. He was a veteran of the colonial wars, a conflict most humans considered ancient history, but which had taught harsh lessons about preparedness and vigilance. The wars had been fought between human colonies decades ago and had resulted in strict military protocols that many younger officers found excessive. Lewis studied the ship formations with narrowed eyes and a growing sense of concern. Lewis asked Jake about the configuration of the unknown vessels and waited for the detailed analysis. Jake replied that the formations were definitely military in nature and not civilian or commercial. The ships had their weapon systems active, and their shields were raised to combat strength. He added that the vessels were not responding to any communication hails on standard frequencies. The Zalcrian fleet consisted of 200 warships, and each vessel was 3 times the size of Earth's largest military ships. To Vrektal, this was a standard occupation force that represented a moderate commitment of resources. He expected minimal resistance and a quick surrender once the primitive species saw the overwhelming force arrayed against them. What the Zalcrians did not know and could not have known from their distant observations was that humans had a saying passed down through generations. The saying was simple but profound: hope for the best but prepare for the worst. This philosophy had guided human military planning for centuries. Humanity had been preparing for potential alien contact for a very long time. After achieving faster-than-light travel, Human governments had agreed that first contact might not be peaceful. They had studied their own history and saw countless examples of what happened when technologically advanced civilizations met less advanced ones. The results were rarely good for the less advanced side. Humanity had decided they would never be the less advanced side again. Every human colony had hidden defense systems built into its infrastructure. Mining operations concealed military-grade weapons. Civilian vessels carried concealed armaments. Scientific stations doubled as sensor networks. The entire human sphere of influence was designed to look peaceful, while being ready for war at a moment's notice. This preparation was not born from aggression, but from painful lessons learned during Earth's own violent history. Lewis watched the unknown fleet organize itself into attack formations and felt his combat instincts awakening after years of relative peace. He ordered Jake to send encrypted messages to Terran Command on Earth and to all colonial defense stations throughout the system. He used old military codes that had not been needed in decades but had been maintained just in case. The message was simple and direct. Unknown hostile fleet detected. All stations move to combat readiness, await further orders. Across human space, officers and soldiers who had trained for years without seeing real combat suddenly found their training becoming very real. On Mars, defense coordinators began running final checks on weapon systems. On Europa, colony administrators started evacuation procedures for civilian areas. On Titan Station, engineers activated systems that had been disguised as industrial equipment for years. Every human installation began the careful process of transforming from peaceful settlement to military fortress. The Zalcrians observed all this activity and interpreted it as confusion and panic. They saw the humans moving around frantically and assumed it was fear. They did not recognize organized military mobilization when they saw it because they had never encountered a species that hid its military strength so effectively. Fractal smiled in his command chamber and prepared to send the surrender demand. This would be over quickly and he would return home a hero. He had no idea that he had just made the worst mistake of his military career. He had not invaded a primitive species. He had invaded a species that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of warfare and had been waiting for this moment with grim determination. The Zalcrian ultimatum was broadcast across all frequencies throughout the Sol system, and their translation matrix rendered Fractal's words into English with mechanical precision. The message was clear and direct, leaving no room for misunderstanding or negotiation. Primitive species of the planet called Earth, you are hereby claimed by the Zalcrian Empire and all your resources now belong to us. Surrender your military assets immediately and submit to Imperial authority without resistance. You have 12 of your planetary rotations to comply with this order. Any resistance will be met with total annihilation of your species and complete destruction of your worlds. The message played on repeat for hours, broadcasting to every human settlement from Earth to the outer colonies. In homes and offices across human space, people stopped what they were doing and listened to the ultimatum with a mixture of shock and anger. Children asked their parents what was happening, and adults struggled to explain that aliens had come to Earth, but not in peace. At Terran Command Headquarters on Earth, Admiral Helen Carter listened to the message 3 times in complete silence. She was a slender woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen too many strategic simulations to count. Around the command center, officers and analysts waited for her response, watching her carefully for any sign of how she would handle this unprecedented crisis. The room was completely silent except for the soft humming of computer systems and the distant sound of air circulation. Helen finally spoke and asked her senior staff for their honest opinions on the situation. Her voice was calm and measured, showing no sign of the anger she felt inside. Colonel Ryan Hughes, head of strategic operations, pulled up a holographic display that showed the enemy fleet positions in 3 dimensions. He was a tall man with graying hair and the confident manner of someone who had spent decades studying military tactics. He explained that the Zalcrians had positioned their fleet in what military analysts called a hammer formation, which was a classic overwhelming force doctrine designed to intimidate enemies into surrender. They clearly believed that humans would see the size of their fleet and immediately give up without fighting. Helen asked him directly if humans would surrender and fold under the pressure. Her slight smile suggested she already knew the answer, but wanted to hear it said aloud for the record. Ryan replied firmly that humans would not surrender, not even remotely, and that the Zalcrians had badly miscalculated human resolve. Several other officers nodded in agreement. Across human space, the response to the ultimatum was unanimous and swift. On Mars, Governor Lisa Franklin began evacuating civilian centers to underground shelters, while simultaneously activating hidden defense platforms that had been built into the planet's infrastructure over decades. The platforms had been disguised as mining equipment and communication arrays, but now they revealed their true purpose as military weapons. On the Europa mining colonies, Director Paul Martinez recalled all workers from the ice fields and armed the orbital batteries that surrounded the moon. The batteries had been positioned years ago under the guise of protecting against asteroid impacts, but everyone knew their real purpose. On Titan Station, Commander Amy Sullivan started spinning up the weapon systems that had been carefully disguised as industrial equipment for processing hydrocarbons. The massive fusion reactors that powered the station could also power enough weaponry to defend against a small fleet. The Zalcrians interpreted the lack of immediate surrender as confusion and indecision. They waited the full 12 days as promised, confident in their overwhelming superiority. Frektal spent the time reviewing victory protocols and planning the occupation administration. He selected officers for governorship positions and calculated expected resource extraction rates. In his mind, the war was already won, and this was just a formality. The Zalcrians had no idea that humans had spent those 12 days mobilizing a war machine that had been maintained in readiness for exactly this scenario. Every human colony operated under a simple philosophy that was embedded in its founding charter and taught to every citizen. The philosophy consisted of just 2 words repeated like a mantra: never again. Never again would humanity be helpless in the face of superior force. Never again would they be unprepared for existential threats. Never again would they trust that the universe was a safe and friendly place. On the 13th day, Frektal ordered the invasion to begin with confidence and anticipation. He wanted to make an example of the human homeworld and selected Earth's moon as the first target because it showed significant infrastructure in orbital scans. The first Zalcrian assault force consisted of 50 warships, moving in tight formation toward the lunar surface. They expected token resistance from primitive kinetic weapons and maybe some outdated missile systems. Their shields were configured to deflect energy weapons, and their armor could withstand significant plasma damage. They approached in parade formation, shields overlapping for maximum protection. Instead of primitive resistance, they encountered Commander Kyle Bennett and the Lunar Defense Fleet waiting for them in prepared positions. Kyle was a quiet man in his early 40s, a former mining engineer who had joined the military after his wife passed away from cancer. He had requested assignment to the Lunar Fleet specifically because he had helped build many of the hidden fortifications during his years as an engineer. He commanded 12 frigates, ships the Zalcrians would consider laughably small and outmatched. His ships were each only 1/10 the size of a Zalcrian warship. But Kyle had something the Zalcrians did not understand. 300 years of human military evolution, born from endless conflict with themselves. Kyle gave the order calmly to all ships to execute tactical pattern Delta 7. His voice showed no emotion, just professional focus. The human frigates scattered in multiple directions in what appeared to be panic and disorganized retreat. The Zalcrians accelerated eagerly, expecting an easy pursuit and quick destruction of the fleeing vessels. Their weapon systems locked onto targets and prepared to fire. Then the lunar surface itself erupted with devastating weapons fire from hundreds of concealed positions, railgun emplacements that had been hidden under decades of mining equipment, and false structures opened fire simultaneously. Tungsten slugs moving at a significant fraction of light speed tore through Zalcrian shields like they were paper. The aliens had energy shielding technology that was optimized against plasma weapons and laser weapons, which were standard in most galactic conflicts. But they had never encountered kinetic impactors moving at such extreme velocities. Their shields were designed to disperse energy, not stop physical projectiles with enormous momentum. Kyle's frigates wheeled around in coordinated maneuvers and launched missiles that performed seemingly impossible turns and course corrections. The missiles carried artificial intelligence guidance systems that adapted to Zalcrian countermeasures in real time, learning and adjusting with each passing second. Each missile carried a simple but devastating payload, shaped nuclear charges designed to channel their explosive force through a single focused vector instead of dispersing in all directions. The result was that each missile hit with the force of a directed nuclear explosion, concentrated into a beam. Within 6 minutes of engagement, 38 Zalkrian ships were completely destroyed, their hulls torn apart by kinetic impacts and nuclear fire. Another 12 ships were heavily damaged and limping away from the battle. The remaining vessels retreated in complete disorder, their tight formation broken and their confidence shattered. Vrektal stared at his tactical displays in absolute disbelief and confusion. His command center was filled with alarms and damage reports from the assault force. He demanded to know what had just happened, and how 50 ships could be destroyed so quickly by an inferior force. His tactical officer's voice trembled as he tried to explain the situation. "Commander, the humans used weapons we have never encountered in our database, and their tactics are completely unlike any species we have fought before." Vrektal shouted that it was impossible because humans were primitives according to all intelligence reports. The data had been clear and definitive. The tactical officer gathered courage and replied that their intelligence had been catastrophically and completely wrong about human capabilities. The Zalkrian Empire had made a critical error in judgment that would cost them dearly in the weeks ahead. They had mistaken humanity's restraint for weakness, their compassion for vulnerability, and their preference for peace for an inability to wage effective war. The difference between those concepts was about to become painfully clear to every Zalkrian commander in the invasion force. They were about to learn the hard way that there was a huge difference between a species that did not want to fight and a species that could not fight. Humans were very much in the first category, and the Zalkrians had somehow failed to understand that distinction, despite all their intelligence. Gathering, Admiral Helen Carter stood before the Council of Earth in the large assembly chamber, her uniform crisp and perfectly pressed despite 3 days of continuous operations with almost no sleep. The holographic representatives of Mars, Europa, Titan, and all the outer colonies watched intently from their projection points around the circular room. Each representative had the power to authorize military action for their colony, and Helen needed unanimous support for what she was planning. Helen stated flatly and without emotion that humanity was now at war with the Zalkrian Empire. She explained that the Zalkrians had rejected all diplomatic overtures and peace offerings. They viewed humans as nothing more than resources to be harvested and territories to be occupied. Helen then formally requested full military authorization to prosecute the war using all available means and methods. Governor Lisa Franklin from Mars spoke first and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Admiral, what are our realistic chances of victory against such a large force?" Helen's expression did not change as she delivered her assessment. If humans fought the Zalkrians conventionally by following their rules of engagement and matching them ship for ship, humanity would eventually lose through simple attrition. The Zalkrians had numerical advantages and their individual ships were larger, but if humans fought the way they had always fought throughout their bloody history, adapting constantly and improvising solutions and exploiting every possible weakness, then humanity would tear the Zalkrian fleet apart piece by piece. The vote was unanimous in less than 5 minutes. Every colony representative authorized full military action without restrictions. Across human space, warships began emerging from hidden berths that had been constructed in secret over decades. Vessels that had been officially listed as civilian cargo haulers suddenly revealed military-grade weapon systems built into their hulls. Mining stations throughout the asteroid belt reoriented their massive industrial lasers, which had originally been designed to cut apart asteroids for mineral extraction, toward tactical military purposes. Even scientific research stations contributed to the war effort by deploying experimental weapons that had been purely theoretical until this moment of desperate need. Lieutenant Commander Samantha Cole led Fighter Wing 7 from the fleet carrier Vigilant, which had been positioned near Earth's orbital defense perimeter. She was 29 years old with over 1,000 hours of combat simulation time logged in training systems, but she had exactly 0 real combat experience until today. That perfect record was about to change dramatically in the next few minutes. Samantha transmitted to all fighter wings and told them to stay loose in their formations, watch their approach vectors carefully, and remember everything they had learned in training. Her voice was steady and calm despite her heart racing inside her chest. The Zalcrian bomber formation approaching Earth's orbital infrastructure was massive, numbering over 100 heavy craft designed to destroy space stations and orbital facilities. They flew in tight and precise parade ground formations with their shields overlapping for maximum protection. Each bomber carried enough ordnance to devastate a small city, and they were heading directly toward civilian habitats that housed millions of people. Samantha's tactical display highlighted the critical weakness in the enemy formation immediately. She transmitted orders to Vulture Squadron to target the enemy shield generators with electromagnetic pulse bursts. She ordered Falcon Squadron to prepare for missile saturation attack on her mark. She told Hawk Squadron to cover the withdrawal vector in case things went wrong. The human fighters moved like schools of fish in the ocean, with individual units operating in perfect concert, without requiring rigid formations or predetermined patterns. Each pilot made split-second decisions based on the tactical situation, their neural interface systems allowing them to process battlefield information faster than traditional manual control systems could ever achieve. The interfaces fed data directly into their brains and allowed them to react with inhuman speed. The Zalcrians never had a realistic chance to adjust their tactics to counter the human attack. Human electromagnetic pulse weapons disrupted their shield harmonics in ways their engineers had never anticipated, creating cascading failures that spread through overlapping shields like a virus. Missiles exploited the gaps in coverage instantly, and what followed was not really a battle but a systematic massacre of enemy bombers. Within minutes, 70 Zalcrian bombers were destroyed, and the rest were fleeing in panic. Samantha felt no joy or satisfaction in the killing, only a grim sense of duty fulfilled. These aliens had come to destroy her world and kill her family. Now they were learning why that decision had been a fatal mistake. She had trained for years hoping never to use these skills in real combat. But now that war had come, she would do whatever was necessary. Back on the Zalcrian flagship at the edge of the solar system, Frektal watched his invasion force crumbling on multiple screens simultaneously. Damage reports were coming in from every battle group and the numbers were catastrophic. He shouted in frustration and demanded to know how these primitive humans were defeating his superior forces. His science officer, who was a veteran of 20 successful conquest campaigns spanning 3 decades, spoke very carefully because he knew the commander would not want to hear the truth. "Commander, I have been analyzing their tactics carefully and running computer models. These humans do not fight like any species we have encountered in our entire military history. They are not following any standard military doctrine from our databases. Every single engagement is different and adaptive. They are learning from each encounter in real time and adjusting their tactics within minutes." Frektal snapped back angrily that all species learn from experience and adapt over time. That was basic military evolution. The science officer took a deep breath and continued his explanation. "Not like this, sir, and definitely not this fast. Their learning curve is almost vertical, and their technology was completely misunderstood by our intelligence services. We dismiss them because they lack advanced energy weapons like plasma cannons or laser batteries, but their kinetic weapon systems and explosive delivery systems are actually centuries ahead of anything in our tactical databases. We optimized our defenses against energy weapons because that is what every civilized species uses. They are killing us with what we considered primitive ballistics, but there is nothing primitive about weapons that can accelerate projectiles to relativistic speeds." Frektal felt something completely unfamiliar creeping through his body and mind. Genuine doubt about victory. For the first time in his long military career, he was facing an enemy that was not behaving according to any predictable pattern. The humans were not just fighting back. They were winning decisively in almost every engagement. Their tactics were creative and unpredictable. Their weapons were devastatingly effective despite appearing primitive. Their coordination was flawless across vast distances. And most disturbing of all, they seemed to be getting better with each battle, learning and adapting at a rate that should have been impossible. The science officer pulled up casualty statistics and displayed them on the main screen. In just 3 weeks of fighting, the Zalcrian invasion force had lost over 40% of its ships. 40%. That kind of loss rate was unprecedented in modern Zalcrian military history. Most conquest campaigns ended with less than 5% casualties at most. Frektal stared at the numbers and felt the weight of his failure settling on his shoulders. He had assured the Empire that this would be a quick and easy victory. He had dismissed the humans as weak and helpless. He had led 200 ships into what he thought would be a simple occupation. Now he was watching his fleet being systematically destroyed by an enemy he had completely underestimated. The worst part was knowing that he had no one to blame but himself and his own arrogance. 3 weeks into the war, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically in ways that stunned military observers throughout the galaxy. The Zalcrian Empire, which was accustomed to quick subjugation campaigns that lasted days or weeks at most, found itself locked in a grinding conflict with an enemy that refused to fight fair by any conventional standard. Captain Nathan Pierce commanded the stealth ship Shadowrunner, a vessel that barely registered on conventional sensor systems even at close range. He and his crew of 15 specialists had been operating behind Zalcrian lines for 2 weeks straight, and their mission parameters were elegantly simple. Make the enemy paranoid about every shadow and every sensor ghost. Lieutenant Karen Walsh reported from her sensor station that they had another Zalcrian supply convoy on the scanners. The convoy consisted of 3 large freighters with light military escort, probably carrying ammunition and spare parts to the main fleet. Nathan studied the tactical plot carefully and analyzed the convoy's route and timing. The Zalcrians were slowly learning to vary their routes and scheduling, but they still thought in terms of traditional supply lines and predictable logistics. Humans had learned centuries ago during their own wars that in space, there was no real hiding if your enemy was patient and clever enough to wait. Nathan ordered his weapons officer to load torpedo tubes 3 and 7. He specified that they should target the engine systems only and leave the crew compartments intact. He wanted to make the Zalcrian ships limp home and tell stories about the invisible human ships that struck without warning. The Shadowrunner drifted closer on minimal power output, virtually invisible against the cosmic background radiation of deep space. At 3,000 kilometers distance, she fired 2 torpedoes and immediately went silent again. By the time the Zalcrian escorts detected the torpedo launch signatures, it was far too late to intercept or defend. 2 freighters lost their main propulsion systems instantly and were left drifting helplessly in space, but otherwise intact. The 3rd freighter and its escort vessels frantically searched for an attacker that had already slipped away into the darkness. Their sensors showed nothing but empty space in all directions. This exact pattern repeated itself across human space dozens of times each day. Small and fast human ships struck from unexpected angles and vanished before any retaliation was possible. The Zalcrians deployed more escort vessels to protect their convoys, which meant fewer ships available for offensive operations. They spread their forces thinner to cover more area, which made them more vulnerable to concentrated human counterattacks. It was a strategic trap with no good solution. The war of attrition that the Zalcrians had originally planned was turning against them in every measurable way. Their supply lines were constantly harassed. Their forward bases were under continuous attack. Their communications were intercepted and decoded. Their morale was declining rapidly as casualties mounted. On the diplomatic front far from the battlefield, other alien species were watching the conflict with intense interest and growing concern. The Confederation of Free Worlds had maintained careful neutrality when the Zalcrians first invaded human space. Now Ambassador Daniel Brooks sat across from their High Council in the Grand Assembly Chamber on their neutral space station. Daniel was a career diplomat in his late 50s, a man who genuinely preferred words to weapons but understood perfectly that sometimes strength spoke louder than the finest speeches. He projected calm confidence as he addressed the assembled alien representatives from dozens of different species. Daniel began by noting that the Zalcrian Empire had told the entire Confederation that humanity was weak and primitive and easily conquered. They had predicted total victory within days. They had now lost over 40% of their invasion force, and the number was climbing daily. Daniel stated that he was present to propose a formal military and economic alliance between humanity and the Confederation. Counselor Thren, a reptilian being from Soria Prime with scales that shifted colors based on emotion, regarded Daniel carefully with multifaceted eyes. Your species has proven more capable than anyone anticipated, Ambassador. But the Zalcrians still have vast resources and can call upon reinforcements from their core territories. Daniel agreed calmly that the Zalcrians did indeed have vast resources available. But resources required complex logistics to be useful, and logistics required security to function. and security was exactly what humans were destroying throughout Zalkrian supply networks. Every week this war continued, the Zalkrians lost ships and personnel and credibility. The question was not whether humans could resist the invasion, because they had already proven that conclusively. The real question was whether the Confederation wanted to be part of the solution, or be seen as complicit in supporting imperial aggression through their neutrality. The message was clear and direct. Humanity was winning this war, and there would be political and economic consequences for those governments who bet against them. Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Meanwhile, at Zalkrian Imperial Command many light years away, panic was setting in among the high command staff. Fleet Admiral Kreshnak reviewed casualty reports with growing horror and disbelief. The numbers seemed impossible, but they were verified by multiple independent sources. Kreshnak demanded to know the exact number of ships the invasion force had lost since the operation began. His aide consulted the latest reports and replied with a trembling voice. 87 ships were confirmed destroyed with all hands lost. 34 additional ships were disabled and unable to continue operations. 22 ships were missing and presumed either captured or destroyed with no surviving communications. The total losses represented over 70% of the original invasion force. In Zalkrian military history, no commander had ever suffered such catastrophic losses and survived the political consequences. Kreshnak slammed his appendage against the console in frustration and shouted that this was supposed to be a simple conquest of primitives. The intelligence reports had been clear and definitive about human weakness. The aide spoke carefully because bringing bad news to angry superiors was always dangerous. With great respect, Admiral, our intelligence was catastrophically flawed from the beginning. These humans have been fighting each other for their entire evolutionary history. They have refined warfare into an art form over thousands of years, and they are genuinely angry at us for threatening their existence. Everything we have intercepted from their communications suggests they are not fighting for territory or resources like normal species. They are fighting because we threatened to exterminate them, and that has unleashed something terrible. Kreshnak felt cold understanding settle over him like ice water. The Zalkrian Empire had not invaded a primitive species that would surrender quickly. They had invaded a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of killing other humans and surviving impossible odds. Every weapon system the humans used had been developed originally to kill other humans more efficiently. Every tactical doctrine had been refined through countless wars against enemies who thought like them and adapted like them. Humans had been training for total war against peer opponents for thousands of years, and the Zalkrians were paying the price for that experience. The aide continued with more bad news. Admiral, there is also concerning intelligence about human diplomatic efforts. They are negotiating with the Confederation of Free Worlds and several independent systems. If they succeed in forming alliances, our strategic position becomes completely untenable. Kreshnak stared at the strategic maps showing the deteriorating situation. Red markers indicated destroyed Zalkrian ships. Yellow markers showed damaged vessels. Blue markers represented human forces, and those blue markers seemed to be everywhere at once. The humans were not fighting like a defensive force trying to protect their territory. They were fighting like apex predators who had been challenged in their own den. The worst part was knowing that the Empire had brought this disaster upon itself, through arrogance and poor intelligence. They had seen what they wanted to see, a weak species ripe for conquest. They had ignored the warning signs, the hidden fortifications, the disguised military vessels, the extensive defense networks. They had dismissed human compassion and civilization as weakness rather than recognizing it as a choice that could be revoked when survival was at stake. Crashes not made a decision that would end his career but might save thousands of lives. He ordered his aide to open a secure channel to Rektal's flagship. It was time to discuss retreat and peace negotiations before the entire invasion force was annihilated. Pride and honor meant nothing if everyone was dead. 2 months after the invasion began, the tide had turned completely and irreversibly. The Zalkrian fleet that had arrived with such overwhelming confidence was now reduced to fewer than 60 operational ships, trapped in the outer solar system and facing an enemy that grew stronger and more aggressive with each passing day. Admiral Helen Carter stood on the bridge of the newly commissioned dreadnought Indomitable, humanity's direct answer to Zalkrian capital ships and a statement of human industrial capability. At 2 kilometers long and bristling with weapon systems that combined human innovation with captured and reverse-engineered Zalcrian technology, the ship was a physical manifestation of human determination and adaptability. The bridge crew worked quietly at their stations, professional and focused despite the historic nature of the moment. Helen ordered a full status report from her tactical officer. Colonel Ryan Hughes smiled grimly as he pulled up the strategic display. The Zalcrian fleet was consolidated in a defensive position around their flagship in the Kuiper Belt region. They were attempting to fortify their position using asteroid debris and ice, but they were running critically low on supplies and ammunition. Human interdiction of their supply lines had been 100% effective for the past 3 weeks, and the enemy was effectively under siege. Helen asked about Commander Vrektal specifically and whether he was still in command of the enemy forces. Ryan confirmed that Vrektal was still technically in command, but their intelligence sources suggested he was facing serious revolt from his own surviving officers. Apparently losing 3/4 of an invasion force in just 2 months was frowned upon very severely in Zalcrian military culture, and several of his subordinates were demanding he surrender before everyone died pointlessly. Helen nodded slowly and made her decision. She ordered the communications officer to open a direct channel to the Zalcrian flagship using all available frequencies. Across the void of space, Commander Vrektal accepted the incoming communication with the hollow feeling of complete defeat weighing heavily in his heart. The human female who appeared on his screen looked unremarkable by most galactic species standards, but he had learned through bitter experience that appearances meant absolutely nothing with these deceptive creatures. Admiral Helen Carter of the Terran Defense Forces introduced herself formally, and then presented Vrektal with 2 clear options. Option 1 was immediate and unconditional surrender of all remaining forces. His crews would be repatriated to Zalcrian space completely unharmed, and human diplomats would negotiate reparations and binding non-aggression treaties with the Zalcrian Empire. Option 2 was that human forces would systematically destroy every single remaining Zalcrian ship, and Vrektal would have to explain to his empire how he managed to lose an entire invasion fleet to a species his intelligence reports had called primitive and helpless. Vrektal's pride warred briefly with his survival instinct and his responsibility to his remaining crews. He asked hesitantly whether humans would truly show mercy after what the Zalcrians had attempted to do. Helen's expression softened slightly, and she spoke with genuine honesty. Commander, humans have been fighting wars among themselves for thousands of years. We understand perfectly well that soldiers follow orders given by politicians and leaders. We also know from hard experience that peace is always preferable to continued bloodshed when that peace is possible and sustainable. We are offering you and your people a way out because we would genuinely rather not kill people who no longer pose a meaningful threat to us. Vrektal spoke quietly and observed that humans would kill without hesitation if necessary, despite their merciful words. Helen confirmed this without any shame or hesitation. Without the slightest hesitation, Commander. Make no mistake about our capabilities or our resolve. We are absolutely capable of extreme and overwhelming violence when we or our families are directly threatened. We just prefer not to resort to that violence when other options exist. That preference is not weakness or inability. It is a conscious choice made by a civilization that understands the true cost of war. 6 hours later, after consultations with his surviving officers, the Zalcrian fleet formally surrendered to human forces. Ships powered down their weapons, lowered their shields, and transmitted surrender codes. Human Marines boarded each vessel carefully to ensure compliance and provide humanitarian assistance to wounded enemy personnel. The formal treaty negotiations took place on neutral ground at the Confederation of Free Worlds headquarters station, a massive structure that housed diplomatic missions from hundreds of species. Ambassador Daniel Brooks led the human delegation with Lieutenant Colonel Samantha Cole and Captain Nathan Pierce present as military advisors and living proof of human combat. Effectiveness, the Zalcrian representative, was diplomatic caste leader Shenval, a very different type of Zalcrian from the warriors who had invaded human space. She was from the intellectual and diplomatic caste rather than the military caste. She studied the humans with intelligent and assessing eyes that missed nothing. Shenval admitted frankly that the human species had surprised the entire galaxy with their capabilities. The Zalcrians had assumed that human lack of natural weapons and armor indicated fundamental weakness and inability to defend themselves effectively. Daniel smiled slightly and acknowledged that it was an understandable mistake based on surface observations. Humans were not physically impressive by most galactic standards when compared to other species. They were relatively slow, physically weak, and biologically fragile compared to many other intelligent species in the known galaxy. But humans were also remarkably adaptable, highly innovative, and stubbornly persistent in the face of obstacles. Human ancestors had survived ice ages, predators, diseases, and most dangerously of all, they had survived each other. Humans learned to use tools not just to survive harsh environments, but to dominate and reshape those environments completely. Shenval observed that humans seemed to be warriors, disguised as civilians based on their military performance. Samantha interjected firmly to correct that misunderstanding. No, that was backwards. Humans were civilians who became warriors when circumstances made it necessary. There was a profound difference between those two concepts. Most humans would genuinely prefer to never fire a weapon in anger during their entire lives. But if anyone threatened their homes, their families, their freedom, or their right to exist, then humans would burn down entire star systems to protect what they loved. The treaty that emerged from weeks of negotiation was comprehensive and detailed. The Zalcrian Empire would pay substantial reparations to rebuild damaged human facilities and compensate families who had lost loved ones. They would establish formal diplomatic relations with humanity and recognize human sovereignty over all of Sol system. Most importantly for galactic peace, they would disseminate accurate information throughout the galaxy about humanity's true nature and capabilities. Other species needed to understand a simple truth. Humans were not prey animals to be hunted or conquered. They were something far more dangerous. 3 months after the war officially ended, Captain Nathan Pierce sat in a bar on Mars with Samantha Cole and several other veterans. They were celebrating the news that the Confederation of Free Worlds had formally invited humanity to join as full members with voting rights and security. Guarantees, Samantha mused thoughtfully while sipping her drink, that humanity had gone from unknown primitives to major galactic players in less than a year. Nathan nodded in agreement and observed that the Zalcrians had actually done humanity a significant favor in a twisted and ironic way. They had forced humans to prove their ability to defend themselves against superior numbers. Now the entire galaxy knew exactly what happened when you threatened Earth and human colonies. Across the galaxy, the lesson was being learned in military academies and strategic planning centers. The footage of human weapons, tactics, and combat ferocity circulated widely through military channels. Analysts studied every battle, trying to understand how humans achieved such disproportionate success. The consensus was disturbing. Humans were natural-born survivors who had evolved on a death world and spent their entire history preparing for war. A new phrase entered galactic common language and was repeated in many different alien tongues. Never start a fight with humans because they are cute until they are not. On Earth, children returned to schools and resumed normal education. Farmers tended their crops and brought in harvests. Scientists pursued peaceful research into medicine and technology. Artists created beautiful works of music and visual art. Humanity went back to being what it genuinely preferred to be, a species focused on growth, exploration, discovery, and creation rather than destruction. But now the military installations remained active and fully staffed. The weapons stayed maintained and ready for immediate use. The hidden fortifications stayed hidden but operational. And every human understood the simple truth that had saved their species. Peace is a choice that civilized beings make, but war is a skill that survivors master. Admiral Helen Carter said it best during her retirement speech that was broadcast across human space. We do not want to be warriors. We want to explore the universe, create beauty, and build a better future. But if you force us to fight, you will discover that a species that survived everything Earth could throw at it for millions of years, and then spent thousands of years perfecting warfare against itself, is not an easy target for conquest. We are not cute prey animals. We are apex predators who learned to be civilized. Never confuse our civilization with weakness or our compassion with inability. The galaxy listened carefully to those words and learned the lesson well. No one made the mistake of invading Terran territory ever again.